comes out bad. See, the problem is that if you ever release that information, then all of your other companies that might do business with you are worried about that. And so they wouldn't want to do business with you. So it's like your reputation is at stake. So if the government demands that you reveal information for a stress test, you have every incentive to try to whitewash it. So the question is whether the regulators have enough incentive to demand and push. The Dodd-Frank Act gave regulators, the Office of Financial Research, subpoena power, so they can go in there and demand information from firms. But it's hard to get it, I think. In the real world, it's a battle. They don't want to tell you. This is the S&P, Standard & Poor 500 stock price index, and it's used as a benchmark for returns. So this is what you did if you just invested in the whole market monthly from 2000 to 2016. And what it shows is quite a roller coaster ride of value, right? So actually, I should have maybe plotted it longer. It was rising for a long time before that. And then it had a huge drop from 100. It fell about in half. And then starting in 2003, it started a long increase again. And then here's the great financial crisis, 2007 to 2009. And then since then, it's been going up a lot here. You know, from here to here, this is 2009. From here to here, it tripled in value. It's amazingly unstable, this stock market. To think that the risk of any other company, the law of large numbers is not working here, because this is the Standard & Poor 500 index. It's an average of 500 stocks. So if they were all independent of each other, the law of large numbers would make the stock market as a whole almost constant. But in fact, it's actually gone up hugely. So there's definite dependence across stocks. But I'm not going to be focusing on forecasting the stock market here. We're going to make the assumption that it's very hard to forecast. So we're going to look at risk as something that we can quantify by looking at the standard deviation of past risks and not focus on what's new right now. Now, what I want to do next is to look at one firm within the S&P 500. What do you think it looks like if I were to plot Apple on the same chart here? Did you ever heard anything about how they've performed? What's that? Does anyone know how Apple has performed since 2000? I guess we're not an eager class of stock market devotees. Yes, you do. Yeah.
Pretty well since the release of the iPhone. That's around 2007.
He said pretty well since the release of the iPhone. Was it 2007? They did a series of releases of different models. You're right, they did pretty well. So I'll show you what pretty well means. Now I'm going to superimpose on this same plot Apple, okay? That's Apple. It looks different because I had to scale it down to fit Apple onto it. So this is quite a good performance because I've rescaled both of them to start it at 100, and it's now at, what is that, 3,500, 3,600, something like that. So that means let's say a 40-fold increase in value in 15 years. So imagine that you were taking this class in 2000. I was teaching this class, that would be 15 years ago. But imagine that you were taking this class then, and you came home to your parents and said, you know, I think Apple stock is a great investment. I just have a quick request of you. Could you take out a second mortgage on the house, borrow $400,000, and put it into Apple stock? Well, if you did that in 2000, your parents would now own over $15 million. The problem is, what's the problem with that? The problem is nobody knows the future. If you knew that Apple was going to do that, you would have obviously done this, but nobody knew that Apple was going to do that. So you would also face some problems with your parents if you did that, because starting in 2000, Apple dropped quite a bit, and you lost, looks like 3/4 of your money. It's hard to tell here, right? It was really limping along for 4 years. So you come back 4 years later, and your parents say, "Do you realize what you did? You made us borrow $400,000, and we're down to $100,000." But then you'd have to be convincing again. No, just hang in there. This is the problem with investing. Hang in there, please. And then it started recovering slowly. So yeah, I think back then, this was before the iPhone, here back in 2001, 2, and 3. So it looked like Apple was washed up. And well, when did they bring Steve Jobs back? Anyone know that? Anyone read about it? I'm assuming you know who Steve Jobs is. Steve Jobs was the founder of Apple Corporation, and he was kind of a difficult guy and kind of quirky, so they fired him. It was his own company, but you can get fired from your own company. And they put in some professional management, whereas he was kind of a little bit strange. The professional management did this. They brought it down to a low value. And then they invited Steve Jobs back. They thought maybe he does have some kind of genius. But they're still doing well after his death. So maybe it's, a company develops a sort of culture and esprit that allows them to keep doing. I really think that's true about organizations. They go on for so long, sometimes as a great success. So for example, The Economist magazine was founded in London in the early 19th century. And it's still a great magazine. How can they last so long? I went and visited them once, and I discovered that they don't even put bylines. They have a different culture. They usually don't put bylines on articles. In other words, if you go to work for The Economist as a writer, you will not become known. They will not put your name, print your name on the articles you write. So how can they do that? Because young people want to establish themselves somehow. But they do. And there's a different culture at The Economist magazine as a result. So every company has its own culture, and it produces these strange outlier effects. This is the return on Apple stock in red, the red dashed line, and the return on the S&P Standard & Poor's 500 stock price index. So you can see that the returns on Apple have been very variable, much more variable than the return on the S&P 500. In fact, when you look at this, it's hard to judge from this picture which one did better, right? It looks like Apple is going up and down all the time. It's this noisy, really noisy. And this aggregate stock market, it looks tame by comparison. It's hard for you to judge which one did better, but you see, maybe if you look, you can sort of tell that there are more ups than downs. But it's so noisy from month to month. These are monthly returns. So here Apple lost almost 60% in 1 month. So it was horrible. The other thing is, I don't know if you can tell that it's correlated with the S&P 500, that when the S&P 500 moves up, it moves up. And when the S&P 500 is down. For example, but see, this is the experience of investing is puzzling because the noise dominates. It's just so scary watching these things go up. And if you take an interesting investment like Apple, it just goes up and down so much from month to month. And it can be under for years. And you can really lose faith in your acumen after it's gone badly for years. So this is just the variance of Apple versus the variance of S&P 500. So the standard deviation of Apple capital gain was 12.8 cents a month. On the S&P 500 on the horizontal axis, and the returns on Apple on the vertical axis. And you can see that the scatter has an upward slope to it, which means they're correlated. But there's it's not that strong an upward slope. So, but when S&P is high, Apple tends to be high in return. And when S&P is low, Apple tends to be low. But it's more variable. Well, this goes from plus 60 to minus 80. And on this axis, I have minus 50 to plus 50. So Apple is more variable than S&P 500. But you can see that there's a correlation. Actually, it's better if I put a regression line in. This is a line fitted through the scatter of points. And it shows, it has a slope of 1.45, which is greater than 1, which means that Apple overreacts to what happens in the aggregate stock market. And then it has noise on top of that, Apple noise, like Steve Jobs' death noise that doesn't affect the overall stock market. So Apple actually so this is going to be a fundamental concept in this course. The beta of a stock is a measure of how it relates to the stock market. If the beta is 1, then the asset tends to go up and down 1 for 1 in terms of returns with the aggregate market. If the beta is 2, then they're kind of rare to see beta 2 stocks. Beta 1.45 is getting high. So Apple reacts more than directly to the stock market. So when times are good, people think they're really good for Apple. And when times are bad, they think it's really bad for Apple. Well, the concept here is market risk versus idiosyncratic risk. So market risk is the risk of the whole stock market. And for an Apple investment, the market risk of that investment is the risk that Apple will do something in reaction to the aggregate stock market. But idiosyncratic risk is Apple-only risk. So that would be the death of Steve Jobs, or the iFlop, the iPhone that nobody liked that occurred once. So they make mistakes, and they take risks. The people at Apple have a history of taking risks. They'll try something that might not work out. That's how they don't always work out, but on average they do. So the variance of the return on a stock is equal to its beta squared times the variance of the market return, and that's called systematic risk, plus the variance of the residual in the regression, the residual in this regression. I think some of this might be, our graduate students can clarify some of these concepts for you.
Combination of all 54 other stock co-moves with the market.
All right, I want to tell you another story. This is a Yale story. Joe McNay was I think he was a Yale graduate. The class of 1954 was celebrating the 25th anniversary of their graduation. That would be in 1979. And somebody said, this guy Joe McNay is a great investor. Why don't we, as a class, give money to Joe McNay and just ask him to invest it for 25 years and turn it over to Yale University as our gift. But we don't turn it over now, because apparently they thought that the Yale portfolio was not managed well at all. And so this was before David Swensen became the head of the Yale portfolio. So Yale was investing in government bonds and safe things like that. They couldn't stomach the variation that you see in investments. But Joe McNay was just this creative guy, and they said, hey, you know, this is just our celebration for our 25th anniversary. We don't care about this $370,000. We want you to invest it for maximum returns, and you can take chances. We're in the mood. Hey, we're all having our beers together 25 years later. It isn't often that investors will tell that to an investment manager. So, right? They don't say, if you lose all of it, well, okay, we don't care. But we think you can do it, so please try. So Joe McNay invested it in Walmart, Home Depot, and some internet stocks. So he took Walmart as this, it's like an Apple corporation, really volatile. But he thought, well, they've told me that I can do this. And so he gave the Yale University $90 million. Quite a success. Now, the question is, I was already suggesting that there's an issue of outliers. So what do we mean by an outlier? Well, there's something I'm sure you've heard about, the normal distribution or the bell-shaped curve for random variables. The normal distribution is a typical distribution for random variables in nature. And that, there are reasons to think that many random variables follow a distribution like this. The distribution has two parameters, its mean and its standard deviation. So in this case, I have plotted it for two different standard deviations, but both a mean of 0. So this is a theoretical probability distribution for, let's say, a return on a stock. And here the standard deviation is 1 on this pink curve, and it's 3 on the blue curve. Many random variables in nature follow this distribution, but not all of them. And that's important because in finance, it tends not to follow this distribution, that we tend to have outliers or fat tails. So this random distribution, the normal distribution, has two tails. This is the right tail, which is high values of the random variable, and here's the left tail, which is low values of the random variable. And the height reflects the probability of getting that value. So if this were the distribution of returns for Apple stock, and let's say standard deviation of 3, of 3%, let's say, then the probability of getting a return of 3% is pretty good. Well, here's 3%. And the probability of getting 3 standard deviations out, that would be 9, you can see is just about negligible. And then I don't even show it anymore. The probability of 4 standard deviations out is essentially 0. That's what the normal distribution says. Now, the normal distribution has been used to describe, for example, human heights or human IQs or SAT scores, or lots of things seem to follow the random normal distribution. And you probably have become intuitive about this. If you see some random variable repeatedly, and it's always been, pretty much always been between, say, -5 and +5, then intuitively you start to think it can't happen that it would be 15, because you're intuitively trained by your life's experiences. But in fact, there are other distributions that are more characteristic of financial returns. So there's another kind of distribution called the Cauchy distribution, and after a famous mathematician. And what I'm showing here is 100 draws from the normal distribution in blue, and 100 draws from the Cauchy distribution in red. Now you see the difference between the Cauchy and the normal. The normal distribution has a kind of look to it. It looks, you see, it's going up and down about the same amount all the time. Well, I'm not saying that exactly right. The probability that it would be 10 times the normal change, the usual change, is negligible. So you never see it deviating from, it has a kind of uniform look to it through time. But with Cauchy, it also looks very much like normal. You can't even tell them apart for long intervals of time. And then bang, there's some big positive value. In other words, the distribution under Cauchy is fat-tailed. So the Cauchy looks like a normal distribution, except instead of just trailing off to 0, the distribution continues out above 0, way out. So you can be deceived by a fat-tailed distribution like the Cauchy into thinking that you're living in a fairly stable world whose risk I understand. But the problem is there are these big events that occur from time to time. The central limit theorem in statistics says that averages of a large number of independent, identically distributed shocks or random variables is approximately normally distributed. But that central limit theorem assumes that the underlying shocks do not have fat tails. So if you're taking the average of stock market returns, which tend to be fat-tailed, then your average is not a good indication of the real average over long intervals of time. Because you might well have gotten a sample where none of the fat-tailed outlier stocks. So my friend Nassim Taleb has written a book called The Black Swan, which got a lot of attention, referring to black swan events. So you've seen a lot of swans in your lifetime, and they've always been white, right? Have you ever seen a black swan? So you might well conclude that black swans do not exist. But in fact, they do exist. There are black swans. And so that's the metaphor he uses for a fat tail. So here is a plot of the normal and the Cauchy distribution. So the Cauchy distribution looks pretty much like the normal. It's a bell-shaped curve. And it trails off, but there's a subtle difference that there are these rare, but they're not quite as rare as the normal would suggest. So the real world puts fat tails in our lives. So here is a plot of it's a histogram of daily stock price changes since 1928. And what this thing is, on how many days there are since 1928, but it's tens of thousands of days. And so what we're seeing here is that the stock market yielded a return of, this is for the S&P 500, or extended S&P 500, of between, I guess this is between, of 1%, with some interval around that. It did that on something like 9,500 days. It earned plus 1% on one day. And then on something like 2,500 days, it earned plus 2%. And then on something like 800 days, it earned plus 3%. On what's that? Looks like it's about, I don't know, 400 days, it was plus 4%. And then here, I can't even figure that out anymore, something at plus 5%. After that, they look like you can't even see them anymore. So you might conclude by looking at this histogram that stock market returns are always between, say, minus 6% and plus 6%. As a matter of fact, on October 30th, 1929, the stock market went up 12.53% in one day. And on October 19th, 1987, the stock market fell 20.47% in one day. It was quite a shock. By the way, on this day, I was lecturing, giving this class. I was teaching Econ 252. And one of the students was listening to a transistor radio. Do you know what a transistor radio is? It's what they used to have before you had iPhones and things like that. So he raised his hand. I'd never forget this. And he said, "Did you know that the stock market is crashing right while you're giving this lecture?" So instead of going back to my office, I just thought, what is he saying? I went downtown and I talked to my stockbroker at Merrill Lynch right here in New Haven. I took the elevator up and just walked in on them just to see what was happening. And it was this turmoil, and everyone, I did manage, because I walked in. If you tried to call your broker, you couldn't. He wouldn't answer. There's too many calls. But I walked in, barged in on him, and I said, "What's happening?" And he said, "Don't worry, don't panic." It was this big event, horrible event. But that was the biggest one-day drop ever in the whole history of the U.S. stock market. So I had the good fortune to be warned of it by my student with the transistor radio. The fact that my student, this was before laptops, but he did, we had problems with transistor radios back then. So that's an outlier. So the normal distribution with the same mean and standard deviation as this histogram says that the probability of a drop greater than 20% is equal to 3 times 10 to the minus 71 power. That's awfully close to 0 if you know. I think that the estimated number of atoms in the universe is bigger. That's 10 to the 80th power. But it's getting on like that. So it's essentially 0. But it's wrong because it happened. I was there. I saw it happen. And I saw the excitement that it generated.
The idea of covariance
Mhm.
when you have two separate stocks, for example?
Okay. All right, I'll try to start keeping things really simple. There's two stocks that we're looking at, two different companies. They're both startups, and they're both trying some risky new venture, and they both, it's like a coin toss, right? They both have a 50-50 chance of succeeding. And if they succeed, they're worth $1 million, and if they fail, worth $0. So we have two probability distributions, one for the stock 1, right? This is 1 million, and this is 0, and this is 0.5. I'll leave it at 50-50 for now. And this is stock 2, 0, same, or times minus 0.5 times minus 0.5. But then there's the chance that one of them succeeds and the other one doesn't. And there's that has twice as that has a probability of 0.5 because there's two different ways it can go.
Right.
It could be A that succeeds and B fails, or otherwise. So we have a 5 probability of minus 0.5 times 0.5. 0.5. So what does that add up to? It adds up to 0, right? Because these are both positive numbers. But these are one, so the product, minus 0.5 times minus 0.5 is plus. And so this is equal to 1/2 times 1/4, right? The two terms here.
Right.
And that's the same here,
Okay.
but with a minus sign. So it cancels out. So if they're really independent like that, then the covariance is 0.
Okay.
And we like that as investors. We don't want to get in trouble. So we want to see independent investment. But on the other hand, it could be that the two companies are really the same. They're really betting on the same idea. And so these are not possible. All right? This probability goes from 0.5 to 0. And then this probability goes to 0.5. And this probability goes to 0.5.
I see.
So now we have a covariance of 0.25.
Okay.
It's not 0 anymore. And that's a flag that, there's danger here. And the other possibility, another possibility, is that they're exact opposite of each other. One will succeed if only one of the two will succeed. One will succeed and the other fails. And that would be a negative covariance.
Okay.
So these things matter, and they become central to our theory in the capital asset pricing model. This is something that's not in the habit of thinking of most amateur investors. They look at their investments one at a time, and they don't, but you always have to go back and say, what's the covariance?
Right.
That's what really matters for what happens to your portfolio, because when you invest in a lot of companies that are all the same, you're asking for trouble, because the whole thing is going to either blow up or succeed.
Right.
And you can't live like that. You have to be looking for low covariance. And the formula, the theory of capital asset pricing theory tells you how to take account of covariances.
Okay, so then really this covariance kind of changes based on how we assign the probability of each pair of outcomes occurring. I think it's actually more
for the whole.
So then we had
turns. With this model. I'm thinking of it as So today we wanted to talk, the idea was to talk about insurance. And it's a very old idea. In fact, in some sense, it even is used by animals, non-human animals. If they share risks, then it's some kind of insurance, maybe. So it's very basic. And I think you have some idea already what insurance is, but it involves an insurance company of some kind, or a government insurance. But the policy holders have a contract with the insurance company to protect them against certain well-defined risks. And for that, they pay a premium, a regular payment to the insurance company for its standing ready to manage those risks. They achieve there's a theory behind insurance, and the theory is risk pooling, that what is a risk for one person is not a risk for society at large if they are independent. Because by the law of large numbers, the number of bad outcomes are fairly predictable. The insurance company pools all these risks, and by the law of large numbers is not really risky in itself. Now, there's a little mathematical formula for risk pooling, which is assuming independence. Let's say it's a life insurance, if every death is independent of the other, there's no epidemics or wars that bring a lot of deaths all at once, then the risk that you face if you're writing N policies, each against one life, is the standard deviation is given by the square root of p times 1 minus p, where p is the probability of death, divided by n and the square root of that. And you can see that as n gets large, the standard deviation approaches 0. So the fraction of policies that result in death becomes practically a known number. That's the key idea of insurance.
According to the law of large numbers, the average of the results obtained from a large number of trials, some random large average of the
moral hazard occurs when people, knowing they're insured, take more risks. So, for example, if your house is insured against fire, you may say, I don't care, I'll be careless with fire because it's insured. So then the risk goes up. Or even worse, if the insurance company insures your house for more than you think you can sell it, you would say, I'll just burn it down, I'll pretend it was an accident. And then I'll get more money than I would have for selling the house. Selection bias is different. It is that the insurance company may not be able to see all of the risk parameters that define risk. Then the customers may see them more. So, for example, health insurance tends to attract sick people. So health insurance companies ask for a medical exam traditionally to screen out people who know they're already going to be sick. If they're not successful in doing that, then the selection bias can harm their business. And it can destroy an insurance business, because if people know that they're going to be sick, then only sick people sign up. The insurance has to be expensive, so healthy people won't sign up because they don't want to pay the expense. And so the whole thing collapses and doesn't work. So you have to deal with selection bias the best you can by exams and disclosure, and also by mandatory. The government can make it mandatory that insurance companies do not look at the selection. So Obamacare is known for that health insurance companies are not allowed to take pre-existing conditions into account. Well, let me give you an example of moral hazard and selection bias in insurance. Many people in this world today are living in marginal economies, subsistence farmers. You have a farm in some very underdeveloped part of the world, and you depend on the crop every year to feed your family. But unfortunately, the weather throws curveballs every now and then. There'll be a typhoon, or there'll be a drought of some sort. So the farmers should buy insurance, right? But how do we do that? So one kind of insurance that's been offered for many centuries, I suppose, is crop insurance. So the farmer buys insurance against the crop failing. That sounds good and workable. There's a problem with it, though. The problem is that it's subject to manipulation. The farmer can lie about the crop right? You can say, I didn't get much of a yield this year. You can sneak some of it off and sell it, and then try to claim on the insurance. Or the farmer can just get careless. You know, maybe he's just not that focused a guy, right? He doesn't do things right. He gets drunk and doesn't do the necessary thing. That's moral hazard. And then there's selection bias. Farmers who know that they're living on marginal land will be the ones who will go for the insurance. So crop insurance has been around, but it hasn't worked that well. So this leads to an advance that occurred in the last 20 years or so, as pushed by the World Bank, which is an international development institution. How about insuring the weather instead of the crop? Okay? Because the farmer can't cheat on the weather. He can't make bad weather. We have weather stations. So does that sound like a good idea? Well, it's a new idea, weather insurance for farmers. And it's starting to catch on, especially in the developing world where it's extremely important. It can be life or death for some of these farmers. But then, does that sound obvious and workable? Can you think of any problems with weather insurance? You have to define the weather very carefully if you're going to describe the effect on crops. That it turns out that you plant seeds on a certain date and they start germinating. They're very vulnerable to drought after a certain number of days after planting. And if the bad weather comes right then, so you have to measure it locally and know exactly when the planting was, details like that to make it work.
Along the lines of moral hazard that Jason mentioned, you cited an article that says that we're transforming from the financial capitalism into more of the philanthropy capitalism. And my question is, do you think that the increase in the number of philanthropists and NGOs causes people in the developing countries to have less of an incentive to insure against natural disasters?
Okay, well, that's a complicated question. The reason we want insurance as opposed to gift giving is because insurance is much more logical and priced out, so we know exactly what costs and what you can expect. So, for example, flood insurance in this country was created to prevent people from making big mistakes. The big mistake that was being made was that a lot of people were building houses in floodplains. And, with sometime in the next 20 years, it's going to be a big flood. And then these people are apparently counting on, well, someone will bail me out. So in the United States, in 1968, Congress passed the National Flood Insurance Act, which specified that you had better buy flood insurance and the government will subsidize it, but it will be priced appropriately. So if go ahead, build your house in a floodplain, but you're going to have a sky-high insurance rate. We're going to price it out. And that's the idea. So people, are forewarned, you better watch out because this is a high-risk area, and the flood insurance rates will tell you that. So that's a coherent system. If it's just philanthropy, then lots of people would be building on a floodplain. So you've got to have it priced out and done right. So in order to make insurance work, it takes a lot of developments, and it's not easy and obvious. The concept of insurance, as we pointed out, goes back to ancient Rome, but it doesn't seem to have taken over. It wasn't managing most risks. It was a narrow scope of risks. If you look at the history of insurance, insurance developed because of specific technical advances, like the development of actuarial theory. So it was in the 1600s that they produced the first life tables. And what they were, it showed the probability of dying at each age. That's what you need to know if you're doing a life insurance policy. What is the probability that the insured will die? And nobody had any statistics anywhere in the world on that until the 1600s. So they started doing life insurance, but it didn't take off well, and fire insurance. It wasn't widely accepted because people mistrusted it and didn't understand it. Even in my family, my grandfather, who owned a farm in Michigan, lost their house to a fire, and they weren't insured. So this is part of our family. My family moved into the chicken coop and lived there because they came home one day. They were on an outing, and they came home, and the house was gone. It completely burned down when nobody was there. So there's some milestones in insurance history about how we can get things going so that it works. In 1840, Morris Robinson, who was the head of the Mutual Life of New York, a mutual insurance company, got the idea that what an insurance company really needs is insurance salesmen. And these had to be pillars of the community type people, and so they had to be paid very well. So the idea was he was going around hiring exemplary men. I assume they were all men in those days. And he had to make door-to-door call. It's unusual. You get a man that looked like someone you'd heard of as a pillar of the community coming to your house. Maybe they would do it through your church or somehow get introduced. But you needed salesmen because people resisted the idea of paying for something like insurance, which seems abstract and you can easily forget the risks. It turned out that you had to pay these guys a lot. They had to keep coming back and reaffirming. They had to pay another visit to you because you would tend to stop paying on the insurance after some years when you hadn't had a claim. Then Henry Hyde in the 1880s discovered having the sales appeal of having insurance with a large cash value. If you stop paying your insurance, you lose the cash value. And it's also a saving vehicle as well. Why combine insurance with saving? Well, because it seems to affect the psychology of the purchase. And Viviana Zelizer, who is a sociologist at Princeton, did a big study of how insurance was marketed in the 19th century. And she said that, talking particularly about life insurance, women were the main beneficiaries of life insurance because men were the breadwinners, out earning an income, and they tended to die young in those days. But women seemed to be, according to her studies, objecting to life insurance, saying, no, I don't want that. So why would a woman say that in the 19th century? Well, partly because Viviana Zelizer concludes they were fundamentalist Christian and they believed in the power of prayer. And they thought, women thought that insurance was some crazy gimmick scheme and they wanted to trust in the Lord rather than in some thing that looked like gambling. So one woman said apparently, you know, this insurance policy, it looks like I'm making a bet that my husband will die. And she said, that will incur God's wrath. I should stay out of that because I'm challenging God to take my husband, and I should not do that. So they developed a different sales pitch. And the new sales pitch was, don't try to explain probability theory. Don't try to explain how this business works. You come to the wife and you tell her, I have a mission. Okay, my mission is to help your husband protect you from beyond the grave. If, God forbid, something horrible were to happen to your husband, you know he would love and protect you if he could. I'm making it possible. And that pitch seemed to work, and women went along with it. So these are little inventions. They're marketing inventions, but they're important. Now we don't need life insurance as much because people live longer. Really, life insurance is to protect families against the death of a father or mother while young.
Is the second advantage of insurance might be that it has an information value that, if, like you were saying earlier, if I look up the going premium on an insurance for insuring some flood on the other side of the country, then I look at the price, if it's going up, then all of a sudden I'm inferring something about the risk in that area without even having visited.
Right.
So that has other externalities.
Yeah, if they didn't have the insurance, the seller of the property has no incentive to tell you about the flood that we had 20 years ago. You can't see the damage anymore, so you might not know. There's no incentive. But if you are looking to buy insurance and then you see they want $1,000 a month for insurance, what are we talking about here? This is crazy. Why is that? Then, yeah, it makes an impression on people. I talk a lot about human psychology and human failures, but there is a certain element of rationality. And that moment happens when you're about to sign the papers for your insurance, and you say, wait a minute, you want me to pay $1,000 a month just for the flood insurance add-on? Then it makes you think. And most people will make somewhat rational response to that.
What do you think about
Insurance is a complicated thing because it has been regulated for centuries, and it's often regulated at the local level. In the United States, insurance is a really local phenomenon. The Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 created a federal insurance office, but it's really mainly just a monitoring for risk. It's not really, there are no national insurance companies. They all have state charters. Also, what protects you if your insurance company goes under? Well, the regulator is supposed to have checked that they're doing things right. But what if the regulator messes up and you buy insurance and now there's some big catastrophe and the insurance company goes bankrupt and can't pay you? So the state governments have set up insurance guarantee funds. There's a lot of complexity to this whole business. It's not so simple and easy. So the first step, it wasn't until the 20th century that these even set up. It's like deposit insurance when you have a bank. When you go to the bank, you'll see FDIC insured, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Well, we have similar insurance of the failure of the insurance companies, but not until 1941. There was no insurance guarantee. So here's our local insurance guarantee fund, Connecticut Life and Health Insurance Guarantee Association. It was created in 1972. That's not that long ago. It's kind of remarkable that before 1972, if your insurance company failed in Connecticut, you were just out of luck. So now they will insure your insurance against a maximum death benefit of $500,000. It's still not big enough because if you are, as a young person, what is your present value, your lifetime present value? It must be several $million. So $500,000 just doesn't cut it, but at least it's something. Other countries have insurance. Other countries, $500,000 just doesn't cut it, but at least it's something. Other countries have insurance. The China Insurance Regulatory Commission has set up a state-owned nonprofit called China Insurance Protection Fund that protects people against failure of an insurance company. But again, they're limited to 50,000 yuan, which is not much money. So we still live in a world that's highly, you got to watch what you get into and check things. One thing I like, this is a course in financial markets, and I like this institutional detail because to me, it's what makes things work.
So when you were talking about AIG the last lecture, and how they got that whole government bailout, what's preventing them from committing their own moral suspicion or moral dubiousness if they know that if something like a big catastrophe happens again, they'll get another bailout because they're so big? Are there regulations in place or?
Well, the financial crisis of 2008 took everyone by surprise. The bailouts weren't the planned course of action. It just happened, it got so severe so suddenly that the government stepped in the U.S. and in other countries to protect the integrity of the whole financial system. Now, the issue now is, does this set a precedent that insurance companies will say, hey, we don't need reserves because we'll just get bailed out? Well, that's a concern, and it's been a concern of lawmakers. Part of the issue, though, is that AIG was bailed out, but the stockholders did not do well. They didn't enrich the stockholders, so it was a disaster. On top of that, I think that our new regulations are stiffer and more aware of that crisis. But you are getting at a really important problem, that too big to fail is a natural problem when you have a complicated interdependent economic system. And if one big company like AIG fails, that was the biggest insurance company in the world, once one company like that fails, the government isn't wanting to just let everything fall where it may. There's a natural tendency to bail out, and it's hard to get past that. We're making efforts to, but it's a fundamental problem. The U.S. government took over securities regulation in the 1930s after the Great Depression.